My husband turned on me after approving our child's surgery, and now I've finally paid him back. I never imagined that love could twist itself into something so cold, or that the man who once promised to protect me could become a stranger standing in the same house, breathing the same air, yet feeling miles away. But that is how grief moves. It doesn't knock before it enters, and it doesn't leave when you ask it to. It settles in the walls and watches you fall apart piece by piece. The day we lost our son was the day everything broke. And what I did after, what I still question some nights, was not revenge. It was survival. Please listen to my story and tell me in the comments if I was right or wrong, because what I did next still divides everyone who knows me. Before it all went wrong, our life in Montana was quiet, simple, and whole. We lived in a small town where mornings smelled like pine and evenings carried the hum of crickets under a big, endless sky. Our son was 8, full of curiosity and light, always asking why the stars looked like holes punched in the dark. He was the kind of child who made the world feel bigger just by being in it. His laugh could make you forget anything painful, at least for a moment. We built our days around him, school runs, backyard picnics, movie nights where he'd fall asleep before the ending. We had plans for his future, small dreams stacked gently on each other, like paper towers we never thought could fall. When the doctor first mentioned surgery, I felt the world tilt. It was supposed to fix something that wasn't quite right in his heart, something that could get worse with time. The doctor said it was risky but necessary. My husband asked questions in a steady voice, the kind that made you believe he had control over things no one really could. I wanted to trust him because he was the kind of man who always seemed certain. I, on the other hand, had doubt pressing on my chest, like a weight I couldn't shake. But when we looked at our son, his small body so full of life, it was impossible not to hope. We spent nights researching every possible outcome. Some days we told ourselves it would be fine. Other days we couldn't even look at each other without crying. The morning of the surgery, my husband squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. He said we were doing the right thing. He said our boy would come back stronger. I wanted to believe him, so I did. It was the last time we stood together as one family. The hospital smelled like bleach and fear. Everything felt too white, too clean, too quiet. I remember the sound of the clock ticking louder than my own heartbeat. When they wheeled him away, he looked back at us and smiled. That smile still lives in my head, frozen in a place time can't reach. The hours stretched until they felt like years. Nurses moved around us like ghosts, their voices soft but distant. Then came the silence, the kind that doesn't need words to explain what it means. The doctor's eyes told me before his mouth did. I remember the room spinning, my knees buckling, and my husband catching me before I hit the floor. But even in that moment, I felt something slip between us, like a thread snapping in two. The first week after the funeral, he barely spoke. I thought he was lost in his own pain, the same way I was. I tried to reach him, to share what we had left, but he wouldn't look at me. Every time I mentioned our son's name, he flinched like the word itself was a blade. I told myself this was grief's way of testing us, that if we held on long enough, we'd find our way back to each other. But grief doesn't bring people together. It exposes what was already there. He started spending long hours in the garage, working on things that didn't need fixing. He said he needed space. I gave it to him, thinking it was love. The space grew wider each day until the house felt like two separate worlds sharing one roof. I'd wake up at night and hear him moving around downstairs, pacing, muttering. I'd sit in our son's empty room and hold one of his shirts, pretending I could still smell his skin on it. The pain was too big for words, and silence became our language. Months passed, and the look in his eyes changed. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was blame. He started asking questions that didn't make sense. Why didn't I speak up more during the consultations? Why didn't I insist on another doctor? He said I had always been too trusting, too emotional. The words cut deep because they came from the man who once held my face and told me I was his reason for everything. Now I was the reason for everything that went wrong. I tried to remind him that he had agreed to the surgery, that we both did, that we both believed it was the right choice. But he stopped listening. He acted like I had pushed for it alone. It became easier to stop talking than to keep defending myself. Every day felt like a quiet trial where I was the only one being judged. One afternoon, I found a stack of medical papers on his desk, insurance forms, hospital bills, things I didn't understand. His name was on everything. My signature was missing. I didn't think much of it at first. But when I noticed the notes scribbled in the margins, calculations, crossed out numbers, reminders to call certain offices, something inside me shifted. He had been planning something I wasn't part of. Grief can make people do strange things. I told myself he was just trying to keep us afloat, to manage the financial mess left behind. But as weeks turned into months, I started realizing that he wasn't just trying to survive. He was trying to erase me from the picture. He stopped sharing anything about money. When bills came, he'd take them straight to his study. When I asked about them, he'd say not to worry. But worry was all I had left. The distance between us grew colder, harder. I could feel him retreating into a version of himself that didn't include me. I missed the man who once whispered promises under Montana skies, who built a swing set in the yard and called it a dream machine for our son. That man was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as a burden, maybe even an enemy. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at me like he was waiting for me to admit something I hadn't done. His silence became louder than shouting. Every shared glance felt like standing on thin ice, knowing it would crack any second. I tried therapy alone, but he refused to come. The counselor said people grieve in different ways, that some turn their pain inward, others turn it outward. I nodded, but deep down I knew this wasn't just grief anymore. It was something darker, an unraveling that couldn't be stitched back together. Still, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Part of me clung to the idea that maybe he'd wake up one morning and remember who we were before everything broke, that maybe forgiveness could grow where pain lived. But love doesn't fix what truth keeps breaking. It wasn't until the day I checked our joint account that I saw it, the withdrawal, a large one, enough to make my hands shake. He had moved the money without telling me. When I asked him, he said it was for expenses, but something in his tone told me he didn't expect me to question him. That's when I realized how small I had become in his world. I wasn't a partner anymore. I was an afterthought, someone to be managed, not trusted. That night, I sat in the dark with the glow of the bank screen on my face and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, clarity. I didn't know exactly what he was hiding, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I had spent months trying to heal the wrong wound. I kept thinking if I forgave him enough, if I understood him enough, maybe the pain would stop. But you can't heal in the same place that broke you. So I made a promise to myself. I would find out the truth. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew I couldn't keep standing still. My son deserved a mother who didn't live in fear or shame. I owed him that much. I owed myself that much too. This was the moment I decided to act. Tell me if I was right to take control, even if it meant letting go of everything that tied us together. After that night, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger yet, not even courage, just a quiet awareness that I couldn't go on the same way. I had been walking through our house like a ghost, afraid to disturb the air around him. But now I began to watch more carefully. Every receipt, every phone call, every change in his schedule started to form a picture that didn't make sense. He had become someone who spoke in half-truths and left trails of confusion behind him. I noticed how he would leave early in the mornings and come back long after dark. He said he was meeting with work contacts or sorting through paperwork related to the hospital bills. I wanted to believe him, but my instincts told me something was off. Sometimes I'd find envelopes on his desk with names I didn't recognize. When I asked about them, he would shrug and say they were nothing important. I didn't push. I was afraid of the look that came into his eyes when I questioned him, like a storm brewing behind a calm face. At night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if grief had changed me too. I wasn't the same person I had been before our son's surgery. My laughter had become rare, my thoughts sharper, colder. I had learned how to hide my feelings behind polite smiles, even when my heart was breaking. I told myself it was to survive, but sometimes it felt more like disappearing. Days blended into weeks, and the seasons shifted. Montana's summer faded into long, windy nights. The fields around our home turned gold and brittle, the sky stretching endlessly overhead, heavy with unspoken words. I used to love the quiet out here, but now it felt like the silence had teeth. Every time the wind brushed against the windows, I imagined it whispering all the things we couldn't say. I started visiting the library again, the one my son loved because it had a small corner filled with picture books. I would sit there for hours pretending to read while trying to remember what peace felt like. The librarian sometimes offered a kind smile, but even that was hard to accept. I didn't want pity. I wanted clarity. One afternoon, I stopped by the hospital to pick up some final documents. It had been months since the surgery, but there were still forms that needed signing, bills that needed sorting. The woman at the billing office handed me a thick folder. She said my husband had already spoken to them and arranged certain payments. That struck me as strange because he always said we couldn't afford much anymore. Out of curiosity, I flipped through the pages when I got home and saw numbers that didn't line up with what he'd told me. Payments had been made in full. Insurance had covered more than I'd been led to believe. It didn't make sense. That night I asked him gently if he'd paid the hospital off. His face went still. Then instead of answering, he changed the subject. He asked why I was going through old paperwork, like I had done something wrong. I apologized, even though I didn't know what for. That was when I realized how deep his control had sunk into me. I had learned to shrink at his tone, to silence my curiosity to keep the peace. In the days that followed, I began to look back on our life before everything happened. I replayed moments I once thought were harmless, the times he'd insisted on handling all the finances, the times he'd dismissed my questions as unnecessary. I had confused that control for care. I told myself he just wanted to take care of me, that it was love, but now I saw it differently. Love doesn't hide things. Love doesn't make you afraid to ask. I started keeping notes, quietly, privately, dates, numbers, odd little details that didn't fit. I didn't know what I was looking for yet, but writing them down gave me a sense of power, even if it was small. For months, I had felt like a passenger in my own life. Now, even if it was just a notebook and a pen, I was steering again. Our house had become a museum of what once was. Our son's drawings still hung on the refrigerator. His shoes sat by the back door untouched. Sometimes when I walked past his room, I'd catch my breath like I'd seen him sitting there. I didn't move anything. Not because I couldn't let go, but because I wasn't ready to rewrite that space yet. It was the last honest part of our home. As the first snow fell, I stood by the window and watched my husband shoveling the driveway. The white flakes blurred his shape until he looked like a shadow moving through fog. I wondered if he felt anything when he looked at the house, or if it had already stopped being home to him. I wanted to ask, but the words never made it to my lips. That winter was long, the kind of long that sinks into your bones. We hardly spoke except for the necessary things, groceries, chores, mail. When we did talk, our voices were polite, distant. It was like living with a stranger who remembered all your secrets. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived addressed to me. It was from a law office in town. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a notice about a joint property review, something about ownership adjustments. I didn't understand it at first, but as I read it again, the meaning hit me. He had been changing things without telling me. Our assets, our home, even my name on certain documents. I felt the floor drop out from under me. I waited until he came home and asked him about it. He said it was a formality, that it was easier for one person to manage things. I nodded, pretending to believe him, but inside I was breaking. The man I had shared my life with was quietly cutting me out of it, piece by piece. That night I cried in the bathroom with the water running so he wouldn't hear. I didn't recognize my reflection anymore. I looked like someone trapped between two lives, one that was gone and one that hadn't begun yet. I knew then that whatever us had been, it was over. But I also knew I couldn't leave empty-handed, not after everything we had built together, not after losing our child. The next morning I called the law office listed on the letter. The woman on the phone explained what he had been doing. Slowly, carefully, she told me about the transfers and adjustments he'd initiated. Her voice was steady, but my heart raced. He had been preparing to take full control of our finances, of our home, of everything that had once belonged to both of us. When I hung up, I sat there in silence, my hands shaking. I could almost hear my son's voice in my memory, soft and kind, asking why grown-ups always made things so complicated. I wished I could answer him. I wished I could tell him that sometimes love turns into something you can't name, something that hurts even when it's quiet. But beneath the sorrow, something new was forming, a small, solid truth. I couldn't save my marriage and I couldn't bring back my child, but I could reclaim my life. I could make sure the man who had once promised to protect us couldn't take anything more from me. As the days passed, I planned carefully. I gathered papers, spoke to advisors, learned what he had hidden. Each discovery burned, but it also cleared the fog that had kept me still for so long. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. For the first time in a long time, I felt awake. He didn't notice the change in me at first. Maybe he thought I had accepted my place in his silence. Maybe he believed I was too broken to fight back. But he was wrong. I had learned that healing isn't always gentle. Sometimes it comes disguised as action, as resolve. By the time spring returned to Montana, I was ready. I didn't know how it would all end yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done being afraid. By the time spring returned to Montana, I was ready. I didn't know exactly how everything would unfold, but I knew one thing for certain. I could not keep living as the shadow of someone else's choices. The snow had melted into soft, muddy rivers along the road, and the air smelled of thawed earth and pine. Everywhere around me, things were coming back to life, but inside, I was still learning how to breathe again. I started walking in the mornings before sunrise, just to feel the cold air in my lungs and remember that I was still here. Each step felt like a small act of reclaiming something I had lost, a quiet promise to myself that I would not let his silence define me. My husband had grown even more distant, though he tried to keep up appearances in front of neighbors or people from town. When others were around, he wore a kind smile that no longer reached his eyes. People would say how strong we were, how they admired our courage, and I would nod while something inside me twisted tighter. They didn't see the truth behind closed doors, the way the house had become a stage, the way our lives had turned into rehearsed silence. He began taking trips to nearby towns, sometimes overnight. He said they were for work, though I had stopped asking what kind. I no longer believed his explanations. Still, I waited. I needed to understand the full picture before I acted. I had already contacted a financial advisor in secret, someone recommended quietly by a friend who didn't know the whole story but sensed enough to offer help. We met at a small cafe 2 towns over where no one would recognize me. The advisor was kind, patient, and explained things in simple terms I could follow. What I learned there changed everything. Over the months, my husband had transferred parts of our joint savings into personal accounts. He had also signed over property rights to his own name, slowly, quietly, as if preparing for something final. There were even notes suggesting future plans that involved selling our home. My name, once beside his on every form, was now fading from our shared life, replaced with his alone. I remember sitting in that cafe with the folder open before me, the papers heavy in my hands. For a long time I couldn't speak. My mind raced through every memory, the nights of shared laughter, the whispered promises, the way he once looked at me across the hospital hallway before everything broke. Now all I could see was someone who had decided long ago to make me small enough to erase. When I drove back home that day, the mountains loomed tall and silent against the sky. I thought about how our son used to press his forehead to the car window, watching the peaks as if they were alive. He'd call them sleeping giants. That memory brought both warmth and pain, the kind that reminds you how love can still exist, even when everything else falls apart. Back at the house, I found my husband in the yard, fixing the fence. He didn't notice when I pulled into the driveway. I watched him for a while through the windshield, wondering if he ever thought about the boy who used to help him hammer nails and hold tools. I wondered if he remembered the promise we made by that same fence, to always face life together, no matter what came. I think he forgot. Or maybe he chose to forget because it made his guilt easier to bear. In the days that followed, I started organizing my own plan, quietly, methodically. I copied every document I could find, bank statements, property papers, insurance files, even emails he had left open on the computer. I hid them in a folder beneath a pile of old photo albums in the attic. It felt strange gathering evidence against someone I once trusted with my whole life, but I knew I had no choice. This wasn't about revenge. It was about survival, about protecting what little I had left of myself. Sometimes at night, I would sit in the kitchen after he'd gone to bed, staring at the pattern of the floor tiles and thinking about how easily one choice could unravel an entire world. I thought about the surgery, how we had both agreed to it, how it had been meant to save our son. I had carried that decision like a stone in my chest, convinced I was to blame, but now I saw how he had taken that grief and reshaped it into control. Maybe it was easier for him to turn on me than to face his own guilt. Maybe it made him feel powerful again. I would never really know. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. I was cleaning the study while he was out when I found a small black notebook tucked behind a drawer. I opened it, not sure what to expect. Inside were notes, names, and numbers, records of meetings, payments, and contact details. My eyes stopped on one page where he had written about a claim settlement. It mentioned the insurance payout from our son's surgery, a sum much larger than what he'd ever told me about. I felt my throat close. He had received that money months ago. He had hidden it, and not a cent of it had gone toward the hospital bills he'd claimed were draining us. I sat there frozen, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. It wasn't just the money, it was the lie. The deep, deliberate way he had twisted our tragedy into a personal advantage. For months I had been living in guilt, thinking I had ruined everything while he used our loss to rebuild his own control. That realization cracked something open inside me. The fear I'd carried for so long began to burn away, replaced by something steadier, something sharper. I knew what I had to do. I spent the next few weeks quietly moving pieces into place. I met again with the advisor, who helped me open a private account and secure certain legal protections. I spoke with a lawyer who specialized in financial disputes. I told her the truth, not every emotional detail, but enough for her to understand what was happening. She listened without judgment and began preparing the necessary steps. At home, I acted as if nothing had changed. I still cooked dinner, still folded laundry, still smiled when he walked through the door. I became invisible by choice, not out of fear, but out of strategy. He had underestimated me, and I let him. There was power in being unseen when the other person thought they already knew your limits. As weeks turned into months, my strength grew quietly. I started finding small joys again, taking walks by the river, planting flowers in the garden, visiting the library without feeling like I was trespassing in my own life. I began to feel the faint stirrings of who I used to be before grief had swallowed me whole. For the first time since our son's passing, I felt a small sense of peace, though it came hand in hand with determination. One afternoon, I drove into town and met the lawyer again. She handed me a folder filled with documents I needed to sign. They were simple, clear, and powerful. With these papers, I could legally reclaim half of everything he had tried to move out of reach. It wasn't just about the money. It was about balance, about acknowledgement. It was about saying, you can take many things from me, but not my worth. That evening, I came home and sat in the car for a long time before going inside. The house glowed with the soft light of sunset, the same golden color I used to love. Inside, he was sitting in the living room, watching television like any ordinary night. I watched him from the doorway, realizing how far apart we had drifted. We had once shared everything, even silence. Now, even that felt divided. I walked upstairs and placed the signed papers inside a drawer, locked them, and sat on the edge of the bed. The decision was made. There was no going back. The next steps would set everything in motion. I wasn't afraid anymore. The days that followed felt strangely calm, almost suspended. He continued with his routines, unaware of what was unfolding behind the scenes. The lawyer filed the paperwork discreetly, ensuring that every move was lawful and traceable. Within weeks, the transfers he had hidden began reversing, assets being restored to joint status. I received confirmations in the mail, each one like a small piece of freedom arriving in an envelope. But what surprised me most was how peaceful I felt. I thought I would be angry, vindicated, triumphant, but instead I felt still. It wasn't about winning. It was about finally stepping out of the fog. I had carried so much guilt, so much misplaced blame, that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply be right in my own truth. One evening, while sorting through a box of old photos, I found one of our son holding both our hands. His smile was wide, his eyes full of light. In that moment, I realized what he would have wanted, for his parents to choose kindness, honesty, peace. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could honor him by refusing to let pain turn me cruel. That's when I decided that my payback wouldn't end in bitterness. It would end in balance. A few days later, the legal process reached its final stage. My husband received notice of the adjustments, accounts rebalanced, property titles corrected, assets restored to joint ownership. I wasn't there when he opened it, but I imagined the look on his face. Not shock, perhaps, but disbelief that I had acted at all. For months he had believed I was too broken to move. He had been wrong. That night when he came home, his silence felt heavier than usual. He didn't look at me as he walked past. I could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. But I didn't speak. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. The truth was already written in every signed document, in every step I had taken back toward myself. I didn't owe him my pain anymore. In the weeks that followed, the distance between us turned from invisible to undeniable. He no longer tried to hide his resentment, and I no longer tried to fix it. Our marriage had become a quiet landscape of endings. I moved through it gently, not with hate, but with resolve. Sometimes when he'd leave the room, I'd whisper a small goodbye, not to him, but to the version of myself that had once believed love meant losing yourself to someone else's comfort. This was the moment I decided to act. Tell me if I was right to take control, even if it meant letting go of everything that tied us together. I began noticing how his silence had weight, like an invisible pressure that filled every room we shared. The air between us thickened with all the things we would not say. He stayed later at work, sometimes coming home after midnight, his clothes carrying the scent of cold air and engine oil. I would be sitting in the dim light of the kitchen, a cup of tea long gone cold, pretending to read, but really just waiting for some sign that he was still the man who used to wrap his arms around me and say that no matter what happened, we'd face it together. But that man had vanished somewhere between the hospital and the funeral home. What remained was someone I could barely recognize, a stranger wearing the same face, moving through the same house, but hollowed out from within. Bills arrived, and I noticed how certain envelopes made him flinch. I wasn't supposed to see them, but grief had made me curious in ways I hadn't been before. Once, when he left a folder open on the table, I caught sight of a number, an amount too large circled in red. I didn't ask about it. I simply memorized it, the way you memorize the face of something that feels important but unfinished. Over time, other pieces began to fall into place. Quiet phone calls in the garage, a new account notification on his phone, the way he moved his credit cards from one wallet to another as if hiding them from view. Still, I told myself it was just stress, just the way people cope differently. Maybe he needed to bury himself in control, numbers, money, logistics, while I was drowning in emotions. Maybe that's how he was holding himself together. But when I asked simple questions, he grew defensive, almost offended that I'd noticed. I started doubting my own instincts. Maybe I was overanalyzing. Maybe grief really was making me paranoid. But then late one night, I overheard something that made my chest seize. He was on the phone, his voice quiet but sharp. He mentioned a settlement, a claim, something about what she doesn't need to know. That night I didn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, tracing the shadows of passing headlights across the walls. My mind kept circling back to the decision, the surgery, the papers we'd both signed, the hope we'd clung to. The doctors had been clear that the outcome was uncertain, but he'd been the one to say yes first. He'd squeezed my hand and said it was the right thing to do. And when it all went wrong, he'd turned that decision into my burden. I started to wonder if he'd known something I didn't. The next day, when he left for work, I pulled out the folder he'd kept in his desk. It wasn't locked. Maybe part of him wanted to be discovered. Inside, I found letters from the insurance company and the hospital. There were forms he'd signed after our child's passing, forms I'd never seen before. One of them showed a payment release. It wasn't a settlement from the hospital exactly. It was a life insurance payout tied to our child's coverage plan. The number was large enough to make me dizzy. It was almost the same figure I'd seen circled before. And the date on the document, the day after the funeral. I sat there for a long time holding that paper like it was a living thing. The idea that he had filed this so quickly, that he'd handled it all without even mentioning it to me, it made my stomach twist. I didn't know if I was angrier at the money itself or the secrecy behind it. Maybe both. That night I tried to ask him gently, but he dismissed it, saying I must have misunderstood, that it was just paperwork. His tone was calm, but his eyes were cold, almost practiced. I realized then that the distance between us wasn't an accident. It was protection. His, not mine. I began to notice other signs, small purchases, things he said he needed for work but didn't match his paycheck. He'd always been careful with money, almost frugal, but now he was moving it around like a magician with cards. When I looked at our joint account, large transfers had vanished into new ones I didn't recognize. He'd even changed the online passwords. It was all too methodical to be grief. It was preparation. For weeks, I moved through life in a quiet haze, pretending not to see what was right in front of me. Grief made me fragile, but suspicion made me sharp. I started keeping notes, dates, amounts, small inconsistencies. I wasn't planning revenge. I just needed the truth to stop spinning. I needed to know what I was mourning, a child, a marriage, or both. It wasn't until I visited the insurance office in town that the full picture began to emerge. The woman behind the counter was polite, her smile steady, her voice even. She mentioned his name before mine, as if he'd been the sole policyholder. When I asked for copies of the claim, she hesitated but finally handed them over. My hands trembled as I scanned the documents. He had listed himself as the primary beneficiary for both the child's policy and an additional add-on coverage he'd taken out just 6 months before the surgery. My name wasn't anywhere on the paperwork. I left the office feeling like the air had been pulled out of me. The world outside looked the same, cars passing, kids laughing, but everything inside me had changed. I realized then that the story I'd been living wasn't the same story he'd been telling. Our marriage had already been rewritten, and I was reading it for the first time. I didn't confront him right away. I wanted to, but I needed time to understand what any of this meant. Money can't bring back a child. It can't repair a family or rebuild trust, but it can reveal where loyalty ends. He'd taken something sacred and turned it into a transaction, one I wasn't even part of. I spent days pacing through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the empty bedroom that used to smell like baby powder and sunshine. It all felt tainted now, like every memory had been quietly bought and sold behind my back. Over time I started planning, not out of anger, but necessity. He'd built a system designed to keep me uninformed, so I began creating my own. I visited a lawyer. I opened a separate account. I copied every document I could find, storing them in a folder I hid inside an old shoebox under the bed. I learned about financial rights, marital property, and how hidden assets could be traced. It felt surreal sitting in an office surrounded by strangers, discussing the practical side of heartbreak, but I kept reminding myself this wasn't revenge. This was survival. Each step I took made me stronger. Each discovery replaced confusion with clarity. I started to see how his guilt had morphed into blame, not because he truly thought I was at fault, but because it was easier than facing what he'd done. When our child died, he hadn't just lost a son, he'd lost control. And control, I realized, was the only thing he knew how to love. He began noticing my calmness. I think it scared him more than anger ever could. I wasn't arguing anymore, wasn't crying or begging for answers. I was polite, detached, even warm when I needed to be. It made him uneasy. He'd grown used to my pain. It made him feel powerful, necessary. But indifference? That was foreign to him. One evening when he came home late, I watched him move through the kitchen, his body language tense, his eyes darting to the mail on the counter. I could almost see the paranoia forming. He didn't know what I knew. That was my advantage. And though the idea of advantage in a marriage felt wrong, I accepted it as a reality I hadn't created but had to live within. Weeks turned into months. My lawyer quietly gathered records, tracing his accounts and verifying the policy details. It turned out he'd already received the payout and had invested part of it in a private fund under his name only. There was no legal reason I couldn't access that information now that I knew where to look. Slowly, piece by piece, I began reclaiming what was rightfully shared. Not because I wanted the money, but because it represented something bigger. Truth, fairness, acknowledgement of what we had built together before it all fell apart. The day I signed the papers to separate our finances, I felt something lift from my chest. It wasn't joy, not exactly, but it was relief, like walking out of a storm and realizing you're finally dry. When he discovered what I'd done, his reaction was quiet. He didn't yell or argue. He simply looked at me with disbelief, like a magician whose trick had been revealed. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes, not of me, but of accountability. That night, I sat in the same kitchen where I'd once waited for him to come home, and I realized I didn't need to wait anymore. My peace wasn't something he could grant or take away. It was mine to rebuild, piece by fragile piece, out of truth and time, and the unshakable decision to survive differently this time. This was the moment I decided to act. Tell me if I was right to take control, even if it meant letting go of everything that tied us together. After I made my quiet preparations, I began seeing my husband differently. The man who once carried our child on his shoulders and kissed my forehead after long days was now someone who flinched when our eyes met. It wasn't the flinch of sadness anymore. It was the reflex of guilt. Every movement, every wordless evening, every faint smile felt like performance. I became an audience member in my own life, watching him act out a version of grief he thought I still believed. But beneath that act, there was something harder: self-preservation, calculation, and a growing fear that I was no longer the broken woman he thought he could control. Some nights I would wake in the dark, my chest tight with the sound of memories. I would picture our child's laugh echoing down the hallway, the way tiny fingers once reached for mine in sleep. Grief is strange. It fades in volume but never disappears. Yet now, it wasn't just loss that haunted me. It was betrayal. The slow, poisonous kind that doesn't announce itself but seeps into every part of your being. I couldn't tell where sorrow ended and anger began. They lived together now, feeding off each other. I kept working during the days, returning home to the same silent house. I learned how to move without emotion, how to speak softly while thinking clearly. There was a strange power in pretending. He believed I was still too broken to act, too weary to question, and that illusion became my shield. I began tracing bank records, memorizing account numbers, writing down transaction dates in a small notebook hidden behind my old cookbooks. Each entry felt like reclaiming a piece of my sanity. I was no longer the woman crushed by grief. I was becoming someone new, someone who understood that love without honesty is not love at all. When I finally pieced together the full scope of what he had done, the weight of it almost broke me again. He hadn't just hidden the insurance money. He had transferred it little by little into an investment account under his brother's name. There were emails between them, cold, transactional, filled with numbers but empty of feeling. He had written that I was unstable, that I didn't need to worry about finances because he would handle everything. Reading those words felt like being erased in real time. He had taken my grief and turned it into a justification for deceit. For a while, I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. The absurdity of it was unbearable. We had shared everything, our child, our future, our fears, and now he was painting me as fragile so he could rebuild his life without consequence. The thought made me tremble, not out of rage, but out of realization. People always say betrayal changes you, but they never explain how. It doesn't just hurt. It rearranges your understanding of human connection. It teaches you to measure silence differently, to weigh every kindness for motive, to see behind every gesture a hidden plan. My lawyer called it protective recovery. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. Everything we had built together, our home, our savings, our sacrifices, was now part of a system that favored his lies. I was simply restoring fairness. But it didn't feel like fairness. It felt like survival through fire. Every form I signed reminded me that healing sometimes means choosing yourself over history. I hated that truth, but I knew it was the only one that could save me. He must have sensed something was changing. He started watching me closely, asking small questions with forced gentleness, but I met his gaze with calm. Inside, though, I was burning. I wanted him to know that I knew, but I wanted him to learn it slowly. I wanted him to feel what I had felt: confusion, helplessness, the loss of certainty. That was the real payment, though I never called it that. I just called it equilibrium. I remember the night I found the final piece. It was an email left open on his computer, an investment summary showing profits from the policy funds. It listed both his and his brother's contributions, but his share was nearly double. That was the proof I needed. The money meant nothing to me in itself. It could have vanished and I wouldn't have cared. What mattered was the truth. The quiet, undeniable proof that he had turned our child's death into an opportunity. That was the point where grief stopped being my burden and became my armor. Something inside me hardened, but not cruelly. It was the kind of strength born from clarity. I began moving faster, closing accounts, transferring assets, rewriting what he had tried to erase. Every action felt both heavy and freeing. It wasn't about punishing him. It was about refusing to let my pain be rewritten by someone else's lies. I was no longer the grieving wife in his story. I was the woman reclaiming her own. He noticed one day that the joint savings account was nearly empty. I saw it in the way his expression faltered, the confusion followed by realization. I didn't speak, didn't explain. I didn't owe him the comfort of understanding. What I owed myself was peace, and peace rarely comes with explanation. I went to bed that night with my heart beating slower than it had in months. For the first time since the hospital, I slept through the night. But still, the guilt tried to creep in. It whispered that I was cruel, that I was abandoning the memory of who we used to be. I fought that voice by remembering the hospital room, the sterile smell, the soft hum of machines, the last heartbeat I held in my hands. That was the moment that defined love, not this aftermath of manipulation. I had already lost the most precious thing life could take. Everything else was just consequence. The more he withdrew, the more I came alive. I started to see beauty again, the morning light through the curtains, the sound of wind against the trees. Grief hadn't left me. It had just stopped controlling me. I realized then that love doesn't always disappear when trust breaks. Sometimes it just transforms into understanding. I didn't hate him. I pitied him. He had built his safety out of lies, and I had built my freedom out of truth. Only one of us could live with that. The day I filed the final legal papers, I felt the earth shift beneath me. It wasn't revenge that pulsed through my veins. It was release. The lawyer told me it might take months for everything to process, but I already felt complete. The world had tried to bury me under loss, but I had learned how to rise quietly, not with anger, but with the simple power of no longer needing his approval to exist. Later, when he came home and realized everything was real, the accounts closed, the property divided, the silence irreversible, his face told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't anger that crossed his expression. It was disbelief, maybe even respect, twisted with shame. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt human again. I didn't celebrate or cry. I simply sat in the living room where our child once played, letting the stillness speak for me. I thought about how love had once lived in this space and how it had changed shape over time. It hadn't died. It had evolved into strength. Sometimes the only way to honor what you've lost is to refuse to let it destroy what remains. I began journaling again, writing letters I would never send, to him, to our child, to myself. They were messy and uneven, but honest. I wrote about forgiveness, not for him, but for me. Forgiveness is not about saying it's okay. It's about deciding that it doesn't get to control you anymore. In those pages, I found pieces of myself I hadn't seen in years. There was one final step I had to take before I could truly move on. I met with my lawyer to arrange a trust fund in our child's name using part of the reclaimed money. It wasn't much, but it was something pure, something untouched by deceit. It would go toward helping children in medical care, children whose parents faced impossible choices like we once did. That act was my true payback, not against him, but against the darkness that had tried to consume me. I had turned pain into purpose. When I walked out of that office, the sun felt warmer. For the first time, the air didn't taste like regret. I wasn't free because I had won. I was free because I had stopped playing a game I never agreed to. When the separation was finalized, the silence in our house changed. It wasn't the tense kind anymore. It was softer, like a quiet after a storm that had finally spent all its rage. He moved his things out one weekend without a word, leaving behind a few boxes in the garage and an old photograph of us holding our child at the park. I didn't move the photograph for days. I would glance at it sometimes and feel that strange mix of sorrow and acceptance that comes when the past no longer feels like a wound but a memory you can live with. For the first time in months, I walked through each room with the windows open. The air smelled new, like rain and wood, and something I couldn't name. Maybe it was peace. Maybe it was just space where grief had once lived. I could hear birds outside, cars passing, the faint hum of life moving on. I realized then that healing doesn't happen all at once. It's not a single moment of relief. It's a series of small decisions to stop revisiting the same pain over and over again. The first few weeks on my own were difficult. Every small routine felt heavier. I had to learn how to live without checking for his reactions, without adjusting my silence to match his moods. But slowly, something shifted inside me. I began to rebuild my world, one habit at a time. I started walking in the evenings, passing through the same park where our child used to play. At first it hurt. I would stop by the swings and feel that tight pull in my chest, but over time I began to see the park differently. The laughter of other children no longer sounded like an echo of loss. It sounded like proof that life keeps going, that joy still exists, even after devastation. I began volunteering at a local children's health foundation, helping families navigate medical paperwork. I understood their confusion, their fear of making the wrong decision. Every time I sat with a mother trembling over a signature line, I saw a reflection of my old self. I would tell her it's okay to not have all the answers, that love is not measured by outcomes. I never told them my full story. I didn't need to. The empathy was enough. In helping them, I found my way back to myself. Months passed, and I learned how to be alone without feeling lonely. The house became mine again. I painted the walls lighter, opened the blinds, and filled the rooms with plants that needed sunlight and care. They became my silent companions, growing quietly the way I was learning to grow. Some nights I still cried, but the tears were softer now, less sharp. They weren't for him anymore. They were for me, for the version of myself that had once believed love and loyalty always meant the same thing. When I eventually saw him again, it was at the courthouse. He looked smaller somehow, not in body but in presence. There was a weariness in his eyes, like he finally understood what he'd lost. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. He handed me the last document for the property division, and for a moment I saw something almost human in his expression. Maybe regret, maybe relief. I didn't feel satisfaction. I just felt done, truly quietly done. After he left, I sat in my car and closed my eyes. The sun poured through the windshield, warm and steady. I thought about everything that had brought me to this point. The surgery, the silence, the betrayal, the discovery, the reclamation. I thought about how grief had reshaped me, how pain had taught me that peace doesn't come from winning, it comes from letting go. I didn't need to punish him to find closure. All I needed was the truth and the courage to stop living in the shadow of his guilt. Over time, I started rebuilding financially too. I sold a few things we no longer needed, settled the house, and began managing the trust fund I'd established in our child's name. The first donation went out 6 months later, funding medical transport for families who couldn't afford it. When I received the thank you letter handwritten by a nurse, I cried, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. My child's name, once spoken in hospital corridors filled with fear, was now tied to something healing. That was the balance I had needed all along. I often thought about the word payback. When people hear it, they imagine anger, revenge, punishment, but my version of payback was different. It wasn't about hurting him. It was about releasing myself from the story he'd trapped me in. I had paid him back by refusing to live under the weight of his lies, by reclaiming my dignity, by building something good from the ashes he left behind. That, I realized, was the real form of justice, quiet, steady, and free from cruelty. One night, almost a year after everything had unraveled, I visited our child's resting place in the small cemetery outside town. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above me, filled with stars that looked close enough to touch. I brought a small lantern and placed it by the headstone. I whispered nothing, because words felt unnecessary. Instead, I closed my eyes and listened, to the wind, to my heartbeat, to the stillness that had once felt unbearable but now felt sacred. I knew then that I hadn't just survived. I had grown into someone my child would have been proud of. Life began to take on new shapes. I reconnected with old friends, joined a local art class, and learned how to make pottery. My hands, once used to gripping pain, now shaped clay into something delicate and enduring. It felt symbolic, molding something fragile into form, knowing that imperfection didn't ruin it. It made it real. Every small creation reminded me that healing is an act of patience. It's not about forgetting the cracks. It's about finding beauty in how you fill them. Sometimes people who knew us would stop me in town, their voices gentle and uncertain. They'd ask how I was, whether I'd seen him, whether I regretted how things ended. I would smile and tell them I was doing fine. But inside, I knew the truth wasn't simple. I didn't regret the choices I made. I regretted the world that made them necessary. I regretted that love had turned into a battlefield where truth became the casualty. But I also knew that in walking away, I had chosen life over resentment. One day I received a letter from him. It was short, almost apologetic, but filled with excuses about confusion, grief, and misunderstanding. I read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the box where I kept old photographs and hospital bracelets. It didn't make me angry. It didn't even make me sad. It just reminded me of how far I had come. I didn't need his apology to forgive him. I had already forgiven him by refusing to carry his burden any longer. Now, when I think back to everything, I see it differently. It's not a story of revenge or victory. It's a story of reclamation, of finding myself again after being lost in someone else's shadow. It's about realizing that love, when mixed with fear and guilt, can become something dangerous. It's about learning that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from what once defined you. The pain never disappears completely. It softens, transforms, becomes part of you. Some nights I still feel that quiet ache when I think about our child, but instead of despair, it brings me calm. It reminds me that love, even in loss, doesn't end. It just changes form. It becomes memory, purpose, resilience. It becomes the strength to face another day. I have finally built a life that feels like mine. I wake up to the sound of wind through the trees, make coffee, and sit by the window with my journal. I write about gratitude, about survival, about how endings can also be beginnings. I no longer wait for anyone to understand my choices. I know why I made them, and that's enough. I've learned that paying someone back doesn't always mean taking from them. Sometimes it means returning what they tried to steal: your peace, your confidence, your truth. I gave those things back to myself, piece by piece, until I was whole again. That was my justice. That was my freedom. Please tell me in the comments if I was right or wrong to make that final move, because it didn't just end our marriage. It ended years of silence, guilt, and powerlessness I had mistaken for love.